This is a WKYT podcast.
Good morning from WKYT News. I'm Bill Bryant, and we welcome you to Kentucky Newsmakers. Hope you're enjoying your weekend. We've had an election season this year with massive absentee and early voting as Kentucky tries to be safe during the coronavirus pandemic. More Democrats requested absentees, and more Republicans have been showing up early for in-person voting. Now, less than 10 days before Election Day itself, the political parties are working hard to swing voters their way. Today, with a high-stakes voting underway, we're going to hear from the Kentucky Republican perspective. GOP strategist Trey Watson will be joining us a little bit later. But with us first this morning from the state Democratic Party is Vice Chair Cassie Armstrong. She is also about to become a member of the Louisville Metro Council since she is unopposed in the general election this year. Vice Chair Armstrong, thank you. Welcome. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
How has the pandemic and the emergency provisions that loosen up the restrictions on absentees and allow for this early voting changed the dynamic of this election year?
You know, as Democrats, we believe that voting should be easy and everyone should be able to vote, and that we should reduce the barriers to people being able to vote. And this pandemic has really shown us why that's important and what a great thing it is for our democracy when it happens. In the primary, we saw record turnout throughout our state. Louisville, the turnout numbers were just amazing. And so I think it's really driven home that when you make voting easy, when you give people choices, it turns out people really like having choices of how to vote. And it turns out people vote in really high numbers, and that's a really good thing for democracy.
There's a projection from the Secretary of State we may have 70% turnout, which would be very close to the historic high of 73%. Do you think these temporary measures that are in place in an emergency declaration worked out by the governor and the Secretary of State, some of these things should become permanent?
I absolutely do, and I think that we'll see a lot of those becoming permanent after this election. They are so popular, and I have heard people from both parties say what a pleasure it is to be able to sort of make a voting plan that works for them and works for their schedule and works for the needs of them and their family. And so I think people would be really disappointed if a lot of this flexibility didn't become permanent after this election. So I think we're going to see a lot of these barriers to voting sort of get eroded, get eliminated, and really, I think that's a great thing for democracy.
Kentucky Democrats are coming off winning the governor's race last year, and yet polling indicates challenges in a lot of your races this year. Kentucky was once dominated by the Democrats, and has the bluegrass state now become so Republican red that Democrats are left to try to claw their way back and are at some disadvantage when the races began?
You know, 2016 was a hard year for us. I think that's something we need to acknowledge up front, is that we did see sort of a loss of support in the Democratic Party. And that's something that we've been working really hard for the past 4 years to rebuild from. And I think we're seeing signs that we are gaining momentum. We're continuing to build on the good work that has happened in races in 2018, 2019, and I believe we're going to make more gains in 2020. For example, we know that Donald Trump won the state of Kentucky by 30 points in 2016. And now polling indicates that that margin has been cut in half. And I think that just shows that the work that Democrats have done over the past several cycles to really re-engage voters and really sort of get our message out there to different communities is really rebuilding support for our party.
So as we go through some of these races, let's talk about the presidential race. What case are you making to voters to support former Vice President Joe Biden over President Trump?
Well, I think we've really seen sort of Trump fatigue throughout the state of Kentucky. And whereas the president enjoyed, he's still very popular, and candidly, having him at the top of the ticket does make it difficult for us in some of these down ballot races. But we've begun to see that support erode. And we've seen that support erode based on the president's rhetoric and based on his actions. And particularly amongst sort of suburban women, women throughout the state. People are just sort of tired of the way that he talks about people, the way he treats people, and the fact that they don't feel like they're better off today than they were 4 years ago when they elected Donald Trump. In fact, with everything going on with the coronavirus pandemic, they feel like their lives are kind of spiraling out of control in a lot of cases, and they feel like they're worse off. And so, Joe Biden stands for the things that Kentuckians need. He stands for healthcare. He stands for opportunity for all. He stands for sort of bringing our economy back in a sustainable and equitable way. And I think that these messages, these sort of kitchen table issues, they really resonate with Democrats throughout the state.
U.S. Senate race is next on the ballot. A Democrat, retired Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath, has outraised and outspent her opponent, and yet the polls show that she has a lot of ground to make up in a short time to do that. Do you believe that she can win the Senate race?
I think Amy McGrath is going to surprise a lot of people. I think she is a great candidate. I think that she is really gaining momentum. She has cut Mitch McConnell's lead to single digits. And we know from 2019 and the great victory of Andy Beshear that Democrats can win statewide. And Amy McGrath's path is going to look a lot like what Andy Beshear's path did. It's going to be high support in Lexington and Louisville and Northern Kentucky. And we've seen that she is doing the work and she is putting in the time and she is really investing in those communities and getting out that message that she needs to get out. And so I think we're going to see some surprises on Election Day, and I think she's going to perform very well.
Many have said that Governor Beshear's victory had a lot to do with what had become the unpopularity of Republican Governor Matt Bevin at the time. In this Senate race, McConnell's numbers are, at least he is at majority approval in a couple of polls that we have seen so far. So there is not that dynamic there was in the governor's race, right?
Well, I think Mitch McConnell is pretty unpopular, and I think whenever Kentuckians really sort of hear about, we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and instead of focusing on meeting the needs of Kentuckians, he is trying to ram through a Supreme Court justice that is going to be a part of dismantling and destroying the Affordable Care Act. Whenever we know many, many, many Kentucky families rely on the Affordable Care Act for health care coverage, and we're in the middle of a global pandemic whenever healthcare coverage is more important than ever. And so I think that Kentuckians understand that Mitch McConnell has been in the Senate for way too long and that their lives aren't getting better, and he's not working for everyday Kentuckians anymore. And so, I don't think that he is this beloved figure throughout the state of Kentucky, and I think that he is vulnerable in this election.
The 6th District congressional race is hard fought as well. Democrat Josh Hicks is the challenger. He's trying to take down the incumbent Republican Congressman Andy Barr. Both candidates, though, have spent a lot of time attacking each other and answering each other, for that matter, and not a lot of time on their own proposals. Can Hicks win a race like that, where he's trying to become known, but at the same time is spending a lot of his time answering some of the charges that Barr is making?
I think that this is a race that is perhaps going to be one of the most closely watched races throughout the entire state on Election Day. I think Josh Hicks' background, he is a great fit for that district. He knows what it's like to work hard. He has varied experiences that just really resonate with the different sort of demographics of the district that he's running to represent. And I think that people are really getting a sense of who he is. And I do think that Andy Barr's sort of continuous, ongoing, misleading attacks on him, people see through that, and they sort of understand that those attacks are disingenuous. They're misleading at best. And so I think that Josh Hicks, I really think this is another race that we might see a surprise on Election Day, and I think that we could have a Democratic representative coming out of the 6th.
Let's talk about state legislative races, also very important, and that is who will be representing folks in Frankfort come January when the session will open up. They'll be talking about the budget and a lot of other issues that are coming up in the state. The Republicans hold supermajorities in both chambers in Frankfort. It means they automatically have enough votes to override a veto from the governor if they stick together. Will Republicans still have that kind of hold on the House and the Senate after November 3rd?
We're seeing a lot of enthusiasm in different pockets throughout Kentucky, and we have so many candidates that are running great races. It is challenging with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, but we have seen, for example, we have a great crew of women running throughout the state. For example, we have Margaret Plattner and Suzanne Kugler, who both have real chances of flipping Republican-held seats in the Louisville area. We have a great crop of millennial candidates who are stepping up and running really energizing campaigns. And I think what we're looking to see throughout the state is the same thing that we saw in 2018, where we have representatives that are really embedded in their communities, know their communities, and even in districts that Donald Trump carried, they still managed to be victorious. For example, Kathy Hinkle and Cluster Howard in Eastern Kentucky. And so I think that, it's going to be, candidly, it's a tough thing to have Donald Trump on the ballot, but I think that we are excited that we think we'll make gains. We'll continue to build on the momentum from 2018 and 2019 and the ongoing organizing efforts. And I think we'll pick up some seats.
Vice Chair Armstrong, it's my intention to conduct similar interviews with you and Trey here in a few minutes with some of the same questions. And one that I do want to ask both of you, a lot of mailings have gone out from the parties in these legislative races. And some of the candidates indicate that they probably wouldn't have sent that kind of thing out on their own. How much liberty should the political parties take in tying candidates for local or state office to national figures, or tying them to issues that are more national than state or local?
The Democratic Party, we work very closely with our candidates in terms of providing resources and whatnot. I'm not aware of any specific examples of what you're talking about. Certainly our intention is always to be helpful to candidates, not to ever put candidates in any sort of position that they don't want to be in.
Okay, let me give you an example. In your case, the Democrats are sending out mailings with pictures of former Governor Matt Bevin with some of the Republican candidates. He left office nearly a year ago. Is that relevant now?
I do think it's relevant now. I think that, Matt Bevin was a deeply unpopular governor who did a lot of harm to the state. And I think to the extent that candidates have sort of tied themselves to Matt Bevin through their actions, through their rhetoric, I think that that's something that voters have a right to know about.
What will the party be doing in these last days leading up to the election, November 3rd? Even though it's an election season, really, right now that's ongoing.
Yeah, in many ways, we're in the throes of the election right now. We have hundreds of thousands of ballots that have already been cast in this state, and that's a great thing. I think we're going to continue to focus on making the affirmative case for Democrats. We have so many great candidates from the top of the ticket all the way down to local elected offices that we can champion and just sort of tell the stories of our candidates and tell why they stand for positive change in this state. And so we have lots of great things to say and not enough time to say it all. And so we are going to be very busy making sure that Kentuckians are informed about the Democrats on their ballot.
Kentucky State Democratic Party Vice Chair Cassie Chambers Armstrong, thank you for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
Stay with us. We'll be back with a Republican perspective on some of those questions ahead on Kentucky Newsmakers. And we welcome you back to Kentucky Newsmakers. Glad you're here. We just heard from Kentucky Democratic Party Vice Chair Cassie Chambers Armstrong. Now the Republican viewpoint as our Kentucky election season continues. Trey Watson is joining us with the GOP perspective. Trey is the founder of Capital Reigns PR and a former communications director for the Republican Party of Kentucky. Trey, thank you very much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Bill.
And that mic sounds good, by the way.
Thank you.
First of all, how do you think the pandemic and emergency provisions that allow for easier absentee voting and this early voting have affected the election season here in Kentucky?
Well, I think there's two ways it's affected it. The first of all, obviously, there's a large percentage of the vote that's already come in. So, as we get, I think we're, 11 days now out from the election, you have a lot of voters who have already voted. So what goes on between now and Election Day won't matter to that percentage. So it kind of changes the way that people will look at the last few days of the election. It also has, I think, significantly changed the way that campaigns are functioning. It changes the way that we contact voters. It changes the way that you kind of strategize your Get Out the Vote program. It makes it easier in some ways, makes it harder in other ways. But, it also, I think, extends the election season, which for incumbents, I think, is easier because it's going to require more money to kind of I've been comparing it to basically you're singing a symphony, and usually you want to hit the crescendo on election day, but now you have to hit the crescendo earlier and try to hold the high note for several weeks.
It's like an election season, really.
Yeah.
So a lot of voters are telling us they like this. You know, it's much more convenient for them. Should some of these temporary measures that are in place because of the pandemic emergency become permanent fixes?
I think Representative Nemes had an election reform bill that he had proposed earlier this year during session that I think had a lot of the changes that you see now. Personally, I've kind of been advocating a couple of these things to be adopted. The first of all, which is not something we're really doing this year, but I think we can do. We've seen the capability to make it work thanks to e-poll books this year. Is I think we can extend election hours. Right now we're 6 to 6. I think we can easily go 6 to 9. I think we have some of the most restrictive absentee ballot rules in the country. I think that we've seen that we can easily stand to expand those a little bit. I'm one who, I know I'm in the minority. I am not a fan of early voting. Like I said before, when you construct elections, you build up to election day, you build up to a crescendo, and to me, when you talk about early voting, you're talking about making the election season longer and making it more expensive. I think that we can, if we do things like expand absentee excuses to work excuses. Right now it's basically, are you sick and in the hospital and physically incapable of making it to the polls, you can vote absentee. I think that we need to greatly expand that, but I'm not a fan of no excuse early voting. I think I'm probably in the minority. I think that will probably end up coming into law, but a bunch of what we see, I think, probably will be codified. I think you'll probably see slightly scaled back, especially on the absentee ballot request front, what excuses are available.
Well, you might be looking at it somewhat from a campaign standpoint.
Absolutely.
Yeah, more than the voters would. All right, so, you were talking about incumbency, and Kentucky Republicans essentially control about everything but the governor's office in Frankfort right now. Supermajorities in both chambers of the legislature. 7 of the 8 members of the Kentucky congressional delegation are Republican. Polls seem to favor most Republicans right now. Can a party maintain that level of one-party control for a long time?
You can. It requires leadership. The problem becomes once you get to be too strong of a kind of single party power, you start to have fractures internally that opens up. I think you saw back in the 90s, there was a period where Democrats in the state Senate, for example, kind of splintered with each other, and you had kind of a weird power sharing situation in leadership there. And you see it occasionally in counties, especially in heavily Republican counties, places like Wayne or Greene, where you end up with a Democrat county judge for a term because the party has fractured itself in the primary, and the losing side couples up with the Democrats to kind of gig the person that beat their side in the primary. And so you kind of end up with weird situations like that. But, strong leadership, kind of keeping the caucus focused on the targets at hand, I think helps with that. The question becomes kind of how you direct the energy of the caucus, and can you keep everybody kind of moving together in one direction?
Well, let's talk about these races up and down the ticket. At the top of the ticket is the presidential race between President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Polls indicate a strong advantage for Trump in Kentucky. Does he cross the finish line in the state with enough of a lead to have significant coattails?
I think so. When you're talking about where he needs, where coattails would matter, which is in some of the rural areas. I think that this will be the last year of what's been kind of a 3-election cycle of the kind of rebasing of the seats in Kentucky. We're used to, for years and years, you had Democrats controlling all these rural seats in East and West Kentucky. There are still a few stragglers, but I think there's a shot that come election day, the morning after, that Angie Hatton out in Letcher County is the only Democrat left standing not in a suburban or urban area, and that's purely because she doesn't have an opponent. I think President Trump's coattails in the rural areas will carry the Republicans to a significant wave of new seats, both beating incumbents and picking up a couple of open seats that are out there.
So you believe the legislature will become more Republican?
I believe so. I think a good night for the Democrats is probably break even or keeping their losses to a net loss of 2 or 3 seats.
Let's talk about the hard-fought U.S. Senate race. Republican Mitch McConnell going for a seventh six-year term in Washington. For the first time in a Senate re-election race, he's being outspent. Does he hold on to the lead that he appears to have in the recent polling in his race with Lieutenant Colonel Amy McGrath?
I think so. I think McGrath has kind of found some footing. She's kind of developed a voice. I still don't think she's developed an identity, which is a problem for your undecided and kind of center-right, center-left voters, but she's at least, it seems like, kind of developed a voice the last couple of weeks. But like I said, a lot of people have already voted. She benefited from this in the primary when Charles Booker came on late at that primary. If you had only had election day voting, or if the primary had been another 2 weeks longer, I think Amy McGrath probably would have lost. I think she may be able to make up a little bit of ground, but when you talk about money, Kentucky is a small state. And the amount of money that's come in on both sides, you just run into trouble on ways to spend that money. So you reach a point where, yeah, she's outraged Senator McConnell, but what does it matter? Because there's limited amount of stuff you can buy. There's a limit on inventory on media bills. And as much as you guys would love to sell, every single second of every single thing that you could to anybody wants to buy it, you run out of ads to sell.
Only 24 hours in a day, right?
That's right. So money only goes so far. But I think Senator McConnell, I think Amy McGrath performed so poorly early on, especially. I would be shocked if this thing is single digits. I think you're looking at a low double-digit win for the leader. A
big race in the heart of the Bluegrass, the 6th District congressional race, a seat that has gone back and forth between the parties over the last 30 years or so. Democrat Josh Hicks charging hard. Republican incumbent Andy Barr has run several different attacks on him. Many casual observers have said to me, why is Barr attacking so much? Is he concerned about holding on?
I think Congressman Barr is just trying. This is a year where Republicans in some areas of the country are struggling in suburban areas, and Andy Barr has a significant suburban population in his district in Fayette County, and so I think he's not taking this race for granted, and he's trying to be aggressive to make sure that there's no chance that any sort of erosion of Republican votes in suburban areas is going to affect him. I think that this district is interesting the way it's laid out. I think when consultants from D.C. look at it, they look heavily at, it's a district based around a liberal college town. It should be something that they should be competitive in, but there's just enough conservative vote in the rural areas that it's a really hard district for a Democrat to win.
The Democrats, though, feel that Hicks sort of has the recipe and that they would like to follow the path of Governor Andy Beshear in the win last year in the district. Hicks, as you said, Lexington tends Democratic, and then Hicks believes he can appeal in those rural areas.
I think the national brand for Democrats is so damaged in rural areas that regardless of how conservative Hicks may be personally, I think the party brand, and right now when you're talking especially congressional seats, I think that a lot of voters, they're having difficulty separating individual from party in some of these seats, especially when you're talking, like I say, congressional with a national theme to it. It's a hard thing to separate.
All right, I asked this same question of Vice Chair Armstrong from the Democrats. A lot of these mailings are going out in these legislative races, and some of the candidates try to distance themselves from those. They'll say, that's not me, that's the party. In the case of Republicans, is it relevant to picture local candidates for state representative and the like with Nancy Pelosi, who serves in Washington, when they're trying to get to Frankfurt?
Used to it didn't in Kentucky, but I think more and more as I said, the national brand of Democrats to rural voters in Kentucky has become so tainted that it has become an effective attack. I think in 2014, Republicans made a hard push to try to flip the state house using Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi. It didn't work. 2016, it was a much more successful tactic. So, yeah, I think that just it's a symbol of the continuing polarization and partisanization of voters in the rural areas, that it is a successful tactic, I believe.
What would you say, though, to some of the candidates who think, maybe the parties go too far with some of these mailings?
Well, I could say a lot of things. The parties, there to help their candidate. The Republican Party of Kentucky, the Kentucky Democratic Party, they really only have one reason to exist, and that is to win elections. And they're going to go through whichever door is open to them. And if once you step foot in the arena, you just have to be prepared for whatever's coming to you. It's not always pretty. Now, what I would say is there's a difference between attack ads and contrast ads. We have, as a campaign person, we have to present a voter with a contrasting reason why they need to change their behavior, why you've been voting for this person for years, but here's why you need to vote for another person. And that requires contrast, and it requires sometimes aggressive contrast, but I think there's a difference between that and negative campaigning, where you would be getting into personal, kind of more tawdry issues.
All right, here we are, the last few days. I guess basically everybody keeps up what they're doing because it's more like an election season. We just have a few seconds left, Trey.
Absolutely. If you haven't voted, I would encourage you to get out and vote. Make sure you do your part, and for the candidates, keep pushing hard and finish out strong, make your calls, and chase your votes.
All right, Trey Watson, who gave us the GOP perspective. He's a Republican strategist. Thank you so much. We appreciate you for being on.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Stay with us. We'll be back on Kentucky Newsmakers. And before we go here on Kentucky Newsmakers, a reminder, we're a little more than 1 week away from Election Day. Many people have turned in absentee ballots already. Remember, certainly, to do that if you haven't. County clerks across the state are encouraging Kentuckians to vote early. And it looks like the Commonwealth will have a good showing this year with turnout. This past week, Secretary of State Michael Adams released his projections for this year. He expects 70% of registered voters to cast a ballot. If that happens, it would be the highest turnout since 1992. Now, it's too late to request an absentee ballot, but you can still look at sample ballots, including those 2 amendments that are on there. Remember that, state amendments. You can also find polling places along with checking your voter registration. All of that information is at govoteky.com. Again, govoteky.com for election information. And that's Kentucky Newsmakers. We want to thank you for joining us. Hope you'll join us bright and early this week for WKYT This Morning, and have a good week ahead.